My name is Rebecca Weiser. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. It's my third attendance, I think, Samuel Griffith Society, so I really don't feel I deserve the honour that I've been given to introduce our speakers, but I am happy to seize it. Our session today is Indigenous Affairs and the Constitution. We have a slight change in that Keith Wolahan will speak first. Keith, I think, a son of, born in Dublin actually, and now a proud Australian, I think has renounced his Irish citizenship. I think we all know what that means. We're very glad you've got your house in order. I read in one of the less reliable rags, I won't name it, but I think it was reliable in this, that he has a great deal of support in the seat of Menzies, so I hope that we may one day perhaps see him in our parliament. Keith has degrees from Melbourne, Monash and Cambridge in law. He's been called to the bar in 2010, but he also served with great distinction in the commandos, and I think that perhaps makes him Victoria's answer to the wonderful Andrew Hastie. And so without further ado, I'm going to call on Keith to speak now about a colourblind constitution.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and that rag was crikey, so ignore everything that was said about it. You cannot believe it. Many years ago at university, I was lamenting the never-ending march of left-wing politics and policies and how numbers and demographics appeared to be on their side. I had just exited a politics tutorial at Melbourne University and was feeling bruised at the abuse hurled at me because I dared not agree with the proposal for the Prime Minister, then John Howard, to say sorry to Indigenous Australians. I was the only one in the class with that view. Even though my arguments were based on reason and compassion, the tutor instead pointed out that as a privileged, wealthy white man, I had benefited enormously from Aboriginal dispossession and should even personally apologise. It was irrelevant to him that I was an immigrant from Ireland, arriving long after dispossession in 1988, and unlike most of them, I went to a public school in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne and was first of my family to attend university. But that identity didn't suit the narrative. To him and the class, I wasn't an individual, I was a group, I was a race, and I was what he labelled me. I needed cheering up. This wasn't what I thought university would be. It wasn't a battle of ideas. It seemed to skip over the nuances of life and politics and society and individuality, stopping at broad groupings of race, sexuality, and class. I started to worry about the sort of world that we were building, and this was in the 90s. So I sought therapy from my good friends Ben Davies and Michael Gilmore, who are up the back of the room. They said, "We have the perfect prescription for you. You need a weekend of soundness. You need to come to the Samuel Griffith Society." I asked what that was. I'd never heard of it. And they replied, "Well, it's a room full of patriots and the soundest people in the country. Trust us, you'll love it. And more importantly, you'll feel much better for it." And they were right. So I want to thank the president of the Society, Ian Callanan, my friends Eddie Gizonda and Stuart Wood, and all of the organisers, speakers and attendees. It has been a marvellous conference. In particular, I want to thank all of you for choosing this presentation over the McGregor-Mayweather fight, which I think is about to start shortly. Although Eddie Gizonda, who knows more about boxing than me, assures me that there is a greater chance of John Stone commencing his address with a welcome to country than McGregor beating Mayweather. So we'll see. Before I delve into the substance of the final report of the Recognition Council, I want to reflect on wider issues surrounding the fashion of identity politics. I say fashion because I find it curious that it is only now that we must review the supposed inherent racism in our public statues in Hyde Park and other public places around this country. And it's only convenient that this has happened after related stories have happened in the United States. Did no one in the left notice them in the decades before? And why have two Victorian councils only now sought to cancel citizenship ceremonies from Australia Day? And what do the recent disturbing events in Charlottesville have to do with the proposals to recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution? Well, they have something to say, unfortunately. Brendan O'Neill spoke at this conference last year in Adelaide. He spoke passionately about free speech, but something he wrote only 2 weeks ago caught my attention and took me back to that tutorial room in Melbourne in the late 1990s. He wrote the following: "The events in Charlottesville are the logical consequences of the politics of identity. One of the nastiest trends in Western politics in recent years has been the relentless racialisation of public life and political debate. Everyone has been forced, often against their will, into a racial box. It's all dear white people, checking white privilege, the problem of old white men. Black lives matter, white lives matter, Asian lives matter, racial re-education on campus, warnings against cultural appropriation. We're bombarded with the messages that we're racial creatures, that our biology and history shape us, that our skin colour determines our privilege levels and our outlook. The predictable, poisonous end result has been the return of racial thinking, the rebirth of the racial imagination. And anyone who tries to opt out of this utterly nasty business, anyone who says, I'm colourblind, I don't judge people by race, is rounded upon. Apparently, it is white privilege to say, I don't think about race. If you want to be thought of as a good person, you must think racially. A complete reversal of how things were just 20 or 30 years ago." And he concludes as follows: "And people wonder why white nationalism is growing. It would be amazing if it wasn't. Over and over, the cultural elite says, you are white, you are a white man, everything you think and do is an expression of whiteness. Your identity is white, that is your race, your history, admit it, own it." And some people have turned around and said, okay. Identity politics is more than just unfair and counter to our Western values and traditions of liberty and individualism. It opens a Pandora's box. And it is capable of being shockingly destructive to our democracy and to our society. The substantive, as opposed to minimalist reforms in the final report of the Recognition Council, effectively seek to give identity politics a dangerous shot of status and legitimacy. They seek to insert race into the heart of our most important democratic document, the Constitution. I'm going to give a brief overview and critique of the recommendations of the final report of the Recognition Council, and I'll conclude that there is merit in minimalist constitutional reform that does remove race from our Constitution. It would be inconsistent to say that identity politics is poisonous and not seek to have that identity removed from it. Although I do not suggest such minimalist reform should happen now, the priority should be in seeing these democratically offensive proposals unambiguously defeated. I understand John Stone will give a broader historical context to recognition, so I will get straight to the final report. The final report by the Recognition Council was released to the public in July this year, containing only 2 recommendations. The first is to hold a referendum to amend the Constitution to provide for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative body that has an Indigenous voice to the Commonwealth Parliament. This body and this voice would have its functions and composition established through ordinary legislation, would be charged with monitoring the use of heads of power under Section 51(26) and 122, and would recognise the status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as Australia's First Peoples. Further details of the powers, responsibilities, functions and composition of the proposed voice are not provided. Instead, the Council recommends that these matters must be examined through further consultation. The second recommendation regards extra-constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians through a legislative declaration of recognition, ideally passed simultaneously by the various Australian parliaments. This declaration, it recommends, should bring together our national story, including our Indigenous story, British institutions, and multicultural unity. Finally, the Council briefly examines two additional matters raised in the Uluru Statement, but sitting outside its scope for recommendations. First, the creation of a Makarrata Commission supervising agreement making, in other words, treaties, and facilitating the process of truth-telling, a reconciliation process. It is apparent from the Council's recommendations and report that a sharp departure from the anticipated trajectory of Indigenous constitutional recognition has occurred. With the delivery of the Uluru Statement at the First Nations National Constitutional Convention in May this year, the Council concluded that Indigenous Australians demanded substantive rather than symbolic constitutional reform. The Council went on to argue that unless Indigenous Australians support a proposed constitutional reform, there is no practical purpose in suggesting it. Desire amongst Indigenous Australians for a substantive constitutional reform may be supported by the Council's recommendations. However, both Indigenous and the non-Indigenous community are left with unanswered questions about the proposed voice's place within our democratic and parliamentary processes. How such a departure occurred after many years of supposed goodwill, as well as numerous consultations, detailed reports from earlier panels and committees, and tens of millions of dollars in taxpayers' money may also be rightly asked. It also leaves us at the curious position where the Council argues that Indigenous Australians have advocated for the retention of race-based powers in our Constitution. These outstanding questions, however, have not prevented many amongst our media, social and political elites from fully endorsing the Council's recommendations. Remarkably, they have done so without details of what the proposed voice would look like and/or any analysis of its implications. It reminds us of a now infamous Sky News interview with Bill Shorten in 2012. He didn't know that Julia Gillard, who was in Turkey at the time, what she'd said on a particular topic, but he nonetheless chose to wholeheartedly agree with it. He said, "I haven't seen what she said, but let me say I support what it is she said," he told David Spears. And Spears replied, "Hang on, you haven't seen what she said." Shorten nodded, "But I support what my Prime Minister said." Spears asked him for his personal view, and he insisted, "My view is what the Prime Minister's view is." And he incredulously asked, "Surely you must have your own view." Unfazed, Shorten replied, "No, when you ask me if I've got a view on this, it's such a general question, it invites me to go to lots of places." And he concluded, "I'm sure she's right." This is the level of constitutional analysis many of our political leaders are providing at the moment. And maybe by now we have come to expect that. But it is also the level of analysis being given by institutions who should know better, including legal institutions, legal academics, legal councils, and corporate bodies. It seems that whatever the Recognition Council recommended, they would be all in. Even better, if Stan Grant recommended it, all the better. More worryingly, relatively few have qualified their endorsement with reservations about the retention of constitutional race-based powers. So where did this supposed consensus for minimalist change go? How have we ended up with such a radical departure from previous reports? This requires a brief return to 2007, although John Stoll will provide a more thorough analysis. Despite the inherent difficulties in approaching constitutional referendum in Australia on any subject matter, Indigenous constitutional recognition has supposedly garnered broad in-principle support across the community and the political spectrum. Some may refer to this as the Canberra Consensus, and Senator James Patterson wrote a very good article, and John Roscombe also coined the phrase about that consensus being questioned. And perhaps it is the same sort of consensus that occurred in that Melbourne University tutorial room. Who wants to be left on their own? Who wants to be labelled as uncaring or insensitive? It's just easier to go along with the group, whatever that is. Former Prime Minister Howard's commitment to minimalist constitutional recognition in the 2007 federal election campaign cemented the topic into recent political debate, and it precipitated bipartisan support during the following Parliament. With the 2010 formation of the Expert Panel on Constitutional Recognition, tangible progression appeared achievable by the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum. To maximise its chances for success, the Expert Panel adopted 4 guiding principles it said any proposal must support. And these are important. Number 1, it must contribute to a more unified and reconciled nation. 2, be of benefit to and accord with the wishes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. 3, be capable of being supported by an overwhelming majority of Australians from across the political and social spectrums. And 4, be technically and legally sound. It is worth remembering these principles, as some of them are obviously capable of being internally inconsistent. At some stage, a choice has to be made, and I'll come back to them. The expert panel's final report was published in January 2012 and set out 7 ideas within 3 key themes. Amongst the ideas were both symbolic and substantive proposals for Indigenous recognition and substantive proposals regarding equality and non-discrimination. Significantly, the expert panel concluded that there was a strong case to remove those sections in the Constitution which could be used to discriminate based on race. Section 25 was specifically identified as a racially discriminatory provision, with 97.5% of submissions supporting its repeal. Encouragingly, early and strong support was found for the concept of race has no place in the Constitution, a timely publication put together by the Institute of Public Affairs advocating minimalist reform that simply removed references to race from our Constitution. In concrete terms, the expert panel recommended the repeal of Section 25 and 51(26), along with the inclusion of a language provision with Section 127A as a symbolic measure. However, it also recommended the insertion of a symbolic preambular statement of recognition coupled to a substantive new head of power through Section 51A and a prohibition of racial discrimination through 116A, as many refer to as the One Clause Bill of Rights. The expert panel's report was followed by the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and they released their report in June 2015. This committee's final report mirrored the expert panel in its recommendation that the parallel inclusion of a statement of recognition and repeals of Sections 25 and 51(26) would be powerful symbolic acts. However, it also recommended the retention of a presence power specific to Indigenous Australians coupled with a racial discrimination prohibition as substitutive measures. When examining the reports of the expert panel and Joint Select Committee, consistent themes are found in their reasoning and their community consultation. It is apparent that the continued existence of racially based powers in our Constitution was seen as remarkable, unacceptable, and for a majority of Australians, embarrassing. Proposals for constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians were diverse, with each hinging on whether recognition should be purely symbolic or include substantive powers or both. However, the retention of racially based constitutional powers that could be used to discriminate against a group of Australians, any Australians, was roundly rejected. These powers were identified as the historical source of many grievances for Indigenous Australians and violated the principle of equality before the law. In contrast, the Council's final report dismisses the ratio behind the symbolic and substantive removal of race from our Constitution and advocates for the retention of race-based powers through both commentary in its final report and omissions from its final recommendations. In its own words, the Council, weighting the wishes of the Indigenous community over the 3 other guiding principles, represents a clear departure from the process and reconciliation of the other committees. They have made a choice on those principles and they picked one. Constitutional statements or declaration of recognition, which had earlier been seen as essential, were rejected on the basis that they may affect future assertions of Indigenous sovereignty. One could be confused as to whether the Council's recommendations are focused on supporting Indigenous constitutional recognition or enabling future activism. In rejecting symbolic measures, the Council dismissively referred to Section 25 as dead letter, whose removal would have no substantive benefit to Indigenous Australians. This ignores the overwhelming and consistent support for removal of Section 25 and its potential application to any Australian. By stating it is the Council's view that there is no practical purpose to suggesting changes to the Constitution unless they are what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people want, the Council showed it has discarded the goal of contributing towards a more unified and reconciled nation. We are left with the conclusion that the Council has advocated for the retention of race in the Constitution if it supports or at least does not inhibit Indigenous Australians' goals. This is remarkable. If we put aside the potential costs to reconciliation and support and popular support the Council's recommendations may have caused, we can examine its actual costs to the taxpayer and the processes that led to its conclusions. There is one aspect of the Council's process that stands out. The Council placed far greater weight on that second guiding principle, Indigenous support. The Council referred to the expert panel's extensive Australia-wide consultations as not designed with a view to securing a represented view from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. This conclusion is questionable, but was used to justify the Council embarking on a consultative process that limited the influence of broader community consultation to instead focus on the 12 First Nations regional dialogues and the National Constitutional Convention in Coolaroo. These regional dialogues, however, were far from transparent. Dialogue saw a maximum 100 invitees, with 60% of positions allocated to Indigenous representatives, 20% to community organisations, and the remaining 20% to key individuals, whatever that means. Whilst the Council claims this was the most proportionately significant consultation process that has ever been undertaken with First Nations, the selection of invitees lacked transparency and resulted in what can be described as a framework for activism rather than a pragmatic cross-sectional community consultation. The Council, of course, completed this consultation process with substantial Commonwealth funding. During Senate estimates, it was reported that the Council's budget was $9.5 million over 2015 and 2016. However, the Council's funding is only one element of the campaign for Indigenous recognition. Recognition Australia, who ran the innovative Recognise campaign, and you might have seen their website and TV ads, Recognition Australia, who ran that campaign, received $30.73 million in Commonwealth funding over the 5 years to 30 June 2017. It is impossible to quantify the broader taxpayer funds spent on recognition through, for example, wider Indigenous and community programs, or indeed the extensive advocacy our public broadcasters have undertaken. So we may not be able to put a final figure on the taxpayers' financial support for this campaign. But if armed, for argument's sake, it is only $40 million from direct funding over the last 5 years, the public should be concerned that it arguably paid to see the Council place us further from achieving Indigenous constitutional recognition than we were in 2010. It hasn't been money well spent. If the money was designed to advance the cause of recognition, it has failed dramatically. I would like to conclude by specifically addressing the proposal for an Indigenous voice. The proposal is for the Constitution to provide for an Indigenous voice to Parliament, but to enact its powers, functions, and representative character and procedures through legislation. The Council has made it clear that it considers the body should not have any kind of veto power over Parliament, and that the voice should be non-justiciable. At this point, it is important to note that much like extra-constitutional recognition, there is nothing preventing an Indigenous voice from being established in the absence of constitutional reform. The Council's advocacy in this regard is contradictory. It argues only constitutional reform creating a voice offers the dignity and recognition that Indigenous Australians have campaigned for, but recognises that statements of declaration may be extra-constitutional. The key conclusion is this: constitutional entrenchment would of course prevent a revisit of ATSIC's abolition. It would be here to stay. In the absence of details, we can identify that the proposal would create a constitutionally entrenched representative body that provides advice to Parliament regarding matters affecting Indigenous Australians, and it creates an obligation for the Parliament to legislate and to maintain legislation for such a body, and it creates a body that is unique in Australian law. These are significant for a few reasons. First, few positive obligations are found in the Australian Constitution, and Parliament has not fully exercised its responsibilities towards the existing examples. This is certain not to be the case with an Indigenous voice. Secondly, a constitutionally entrenched voice to the Parliament would not be analogous to any Commonwealth statutory body, and would require consideration and adjustment of administrative and constitutional law surrounding, for example, its operation, funding, and accountability. Third, this body would provide a representative function to Parliament based on the sole criteria of indigeneity, whatever that means. And the corollary issue of how that is to be defined is a court to define that, and how could that possibly occur, and where would the boundary be drawn? Fourth, functional questions including how advice would be tabled, the temporal relationship between the body's advice and Parliament's procedures, the duty of Parliament or the Executive to consider the advice, and the scope of matters affecting Indigenous Australians all remain outstanding. And finally, it should not need to be said, but Indigenous Australians do have a voice in the Australian Parliament. It's the Parliament itself. Their voice is the same as all of ours. The Council's only express recommendation for constitutional reform sees the Indigenous voice monitoring heads of power that have traditionally affected Indigenous Australians. Despite the Council's claims the Indigenous voice would be non-justiciable, this will probably be limited to its advice or advocacy within Parliament. The first area vulnerable to legal challenge is Parliament's obligation to create the body and its power to amend legislation. Beyond questions of its operation, we are brought to the political and activist risk of an Indigenous voice. The voice may not be created with an express legal veto, but it will wield a de facto political veto over many policy areas and large portions of the Indigenous community. This is important because it divides Australians into categories, into identities, those with and without parliamentary representation through the body. As Senator James Paterson has argued, a constitutionally entrenched body with a representative function based on race violates the important principle of equality before the law. It also flies in the face of the expert panel's second principle of contributing to a more unified and reconciled nation, as the symbolism of removing race from the Constitution is important for all Australians, not just the Indigenous community. The trajectory for Indigenous recognition through constitutional reform has been unexpectedly and radically altered by the Council. The Council's decision is wrong and should be rejected for several reasons. First, the widespread support from across the Australian community for race to be excluded from the Constitution should be respected and encouraged, even if the Indigenous community, to the extent that that is capable of being accurately captured in one voice, disagrees. Secondly, Section 25 and 5126 may be applied to any group or groups of Australians deemed necessary, making this an issue for the entire Australian community. Finally, the retention of race in the Constitution places underlying democratic values and rights in conflict with the supreme law of the land. With the majority of our fundamental freedoms expressed in the common law and protected through the principle of legality, the inclusion of constitutional provisions that expressly undermine equality before the law is a contradiction and inimical to our status as a liberal democracy. Race should have no place in our Constitution. To paraphrase the Joint Select Committee, advocacy for its retention is remarkable. Many things happened in my life after that tutorial class in the 1990s. I had the privilege of witnessing many young, brave Australians do dangerous and amazing things in war and in our name. Some of them joined the 102,000 names on a national war memorial. Our Constitution is no more for them than it is for Indigenous Australians or anyone else, because it is for all of us equally. No one has special status on service, on race, or anything else. And I find that beautiful, and I find it's worth fighting for. So thank you.